All right, welcome back to another week of Album Impact with Joshua Ray Gooch. This week we have a very good friend of mine and a fantastic musician. Primarily, I've known him as a bass player, but he also has his hands in mastering and all sorts of other instrumentation for production. Whynot Jansveld is with us today. Say hi, everybody.
Hey, buddy. What's going on?
Man, it's going well. It's nice to have you. So Whynot is fantastic. He is a great musician that both tours and also works in the studio. And you know, some of the folks that he works with quite often are Butch Walker, both in a touring sense as well as in the studio. And you kind of function with a couple other friends of ours as his sort of primary band, not only on the road but in the studio as well. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I do some studio work for him. Unfortunately for me, Butch is also a fine bass player, and so he doesn't need me as much as he does our great drummer Mark Stepro. But yeah, every once in a while, when like a band vibe is called for, and we just kind of want to be in the studio and do something as a band, yeah, I get to go.
Yeah. Well, and Butch, as anybody who knows Butch's music and his production, he's an extremely talented guy that can do a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, he's one of those guys like a Prince guy that could just do a record completely on his own, playing everything himself and produce it and mix it. And he's an exceptional guy. But you also do a similar thing with Linda Perry, where you work with her studio stuff and with artists that she's working with. How is that? I know that's been something you've done for the last couple of years. How's that been?
It's been great. I met her actually on her to do a gig on with her as the artist, and it was a benefit here in LA, and we played a couple songs and a couple covers and a couple of her songs, and yeah, and since then she's had me in to do studio work for her, and you know, less now that we're all stuck at home, obviously, but you know, hopefully they'll come back.
Yeah. And then you've also worked with people like Natasha Bedingfield, and you've played bass on a couple albums that I really love by the Weepies, which I consider as far as sort of like, I don't even know what you'd call them, sort of like ambient duo acoustic. I don't even know what that would be, but it's awesome.
Indie folk. Yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah.
But it's beautiful music.
Yeah. And then on the other end of the spectrum, and this is why I'm such a big fan of you, is that you also used to fill in for Tim LaFave sometimes with Wayne Krantz.
Right.
So it's like the complete other, you know, we've got this like really cool sort of bass stuff where you get to play almost like Paul McCartney-esque with these, you know, melodies along with singer-songwriter stuff. And then you're also playing what I would consider probably some of the most groundbreaking fusion. I don't even know what to call it, but it's a fusion of a lot of different things in Wayne Krantz's music. I think rhythmically, he really broke a lot of new ground, and it's really cool that when you used to live back in New York, you used to play with him as well as doing this completely divergent session stuff on like singer-songwriter albums.
Yeah. The Wayne Krantz stuff was it's definitely the craziest gig I've ever done by a mile, and so much fun, and it pushed me in you know, in a bunch of different ways that I had never really sort of like roads that I had never gone down before. Like that whole group improvisation thing was like entirely new to me and scary, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but
and you're
like,
filling
really,
in for Tim LaFave, who anybody who knows bass stuff, Tim is another badass bass player. So that's a very cool gig. And Whynot and I actually play together quite a lot. We've done a ton of different gigs. We've actually done stuff for Apogee, which we are both using their hype mics today, which is fantastic. But we did some videos for them, and we've done a whole bunch of other gigs. But we also did a kind of Christmas New Year's gig with Larry Goldings, who I think I can probably speak for both of us saying that Larry's one of our favorite keyboard players ever, and probably one of the best living keyboard players. So that was an especially fun gig. There's a lot of video from that.
That was so much fun. I just idolized, you know, John Scofield's band that he played with and you know, he's just so good.
Well, and the way that you ended up doing that gig was kind of a strange situation. The bass player that was going to do the gig ended up hurting his back, and he was literally like,
I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, no, of course not. No, you would never. The Dutch are very, very calm people with not a violent bone in their body.
Very reasonable.
But the bass player hurt his back and was literally like, yo, I'm on the floor. I can't move.
Yeah.
I don't think I can do the gig. And, you know, initially we were like, well, Larry Golding's, if there's anybody who can do like key bass, he's the guy. But we weren't only doing organ trio music. We were doing a lot of other, the goal was to do a lot of other styles.
Yeah.
And so he ended up being like, well, I don't know, maybe we can get a bass player. And I was like, I got a guy. And I called you and you were literally swimming in a public pool. And I was like, can you get over for rehearsal in an hour? And you're like, yep. And you hopped out of the pool, came over for rehearsal, and we did the gig the next like day, I think. And it was one of the most fun gigs I've ever done. So that's a highlight of Whynot and I's musical friendship right there.
Correct.
So you are our first international guest.
Oh, wow.
Now, I know that you've been living in the States for a while now, but being that we're going to be talking about records that came out in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, this is going to be an interesting conversation because you're going to have a perspective on European radio and the prevalence of certain styles that were not completely poo-pooed in the United States, but had some difficulty with American radio, in particularly one of the records that you chose. So I'm very interested to get the input from somebody because really actually the other band that you chose is actually a European band. So this is going to be very interesting. I'm excited to talk about this. Do you want to say which two records you chose, and then we can talk about which one we're going to start with?
Sure. I chose, and I'll explain briefly, very, very briefly why, and then we'll get into it. But the first record I chose was Tears for Fears, Songs from the Big Chair, which came out in 1985 and was a massive hit in Europe as well as here in the States. It was the first record that I bought with my own money, and I love it to this day, and I think it had a big influence on me. So that's why I picked that. And the second record that I chose is by a band called Mother's Finest, who a lot of people will not have heard of, and they are from Atlanta, Georgia. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if it's actually Atlanta, but for sure Georgia.
Yeah, but they're a Georgia band.
Georgia band that came to be in the 70s, still plays to this day, and for some reason, other than having regional success in Georgia and surrounding states, became really big in Holland and Germany. And I've actually sort of like dug into how that happened.
Oh, that's okay. I'm excited to get into that.
Yeah. And I chose their live record. It's just called Mother's Finest Live. It came out in 1979. I didn't discover it until probably, a decade later, when I was in my teens. And and as you pointed out, it is kind of like a interesting opposite, right? A European band that did make it huge in the United States and everywhere else, and an American band that actually was bigger in certain parts of Europe than they were in the United States.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. Well, which record do you want to start with? Which one do you want to go chronologically when they came out? Do you want to go when they came into your life? Which one do you want to hop into?
Well, why don't we do that? Let's start with the Tears for Fears one.
Okay.
For that reason, yeah.
I'm really glad you picked this record because I would say some of my bigger blind spots musically are 80s sort of new wave or second British invasion bands.
Yeah.
Other than maybe like The Cure and stuff like that. There's a couple bands that I was very familiar with, but I would say like I have a very vast musical interest, and for some reason that era sort of just got through, and it probably has a lot to do with like it wasn't old enough to be retro when I started playing, and the sound sounded very, when I was a teenager, very dated to me. And I'm so glad you picked this record because I'm absolutely obsessed with it.
Amazing.
And have not only gotten obsessed with this record, but subsequently like The Hurting and some other records from them. So we'll get into that. But what initiated you going out and buying this with your own money? Were you already playing bass at that time? And what made you take your money as a teenager, when I'm sure money is not falling out of your pockets, and go buy this record?
Yeah, no, right. It came out right around the time that I started playing bass, and I had been playing guitar. So I started playing guitar when I was 9, and bass didn't happen until I was about 16, which is right when that record came out. And I don't think the two necessarily had anything to do with one another, but I do know that obviously this was a time where you, you couldn't like look it up on the internet or like, um, and so the process was you would go to the record store, and they'd have these like listening, booths set, not a booth, but it's basically like a bar almost, right, around where they're selling the records. And you would just bring them a record and ask them if they could put it on, and then you put on the headphones and you just sit there and listen to it. I don't know if that. I actually have no idea if that was the case here in the U.S.
I don't know at the time, but I know there are specialty record stores that do that now. But I mean, I have no idea.
And you're obviously too young to know that from back then, because this
I wasn't.
What, 5 years before you were even born?
I think 6 years. Yeah. Exactly. I wasn't even a glint in my father's eye.
Right.
But I do know that like that is a thing, because there is still something very magical about that. And I know that a lot of current record stores, they're sort of selling a nostalgia to a certain extent. And I know a lot of places do that. So I would imagine at the time, along with in the Netherlands, it was probably a thing here as well. And I've heard people say stories like that before.
Yeah, it must have been. And I truthfully, I don't remember exactly why I picked that record. I would imagine that they probably were already on the radio. You know what I mean? I might have heard one of their hits.
That's what I was curious about, because in doing some reading,
right,
The Hurting did much, but so Tears for Fears' first record, The Hurting, I think it came out in 1982.
Right.
Was much bigger in Europe than it was in the United States.
Right.
They had a bit of a hit here with Mad World, but nothing super substantial. But they had, I believe, 3 hits with like Pale Shelter, Mad World, and I don't know what the third one was.
I'm blanking on it now too.
But it was really big in the UK. But I did notice when I was reading about it, the Netherlands kept popping up where it had charted specifically in the Netherlands, their first album. And it did not do even nearly that well in the States. So I'm very curious if you don't have any memory of hearing Pale Shelter or anything on the radio.
No, I don't. And certainly I didn't latch onto that band during that, the era of that first record. It definitely was songs from the Big Chair that piqued my interest. And I also think the order of magnitude of like, what those hits were from both records were not the same at all. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Like songs from the Big Chair. I mean, it blew up. It was everywhere. So I would imagine I heard it on the radio and was like, this sounds amazing, and I need to know more. I need to have more.
Yeah.
I need to have it.
And do you know it, because there's some interesting factors about this record as far as like Everybody Wants to Rule the World was very much geared towards the United States. Not that they wrote it as like a pandering to the United States, but it's very much, and we both watched this documentary that you sent to me that was like a BBC Classic Albums documentary, and they talked about the label president, or I can't remember his exact title. He was imagining a very American scene of like driving down the PCH with your arm out the window, listening to like highway music, right?
Yeah.
And Everybody Wants to Rule the World, when he heard that, he was like, this is it. This is the song. But they were talking more about the UK than the Netherlands, but that wasn't necessarily the case there. So do you know if it was Shout or Everybody Wants to Rule the World or Head Over Heels that maybe not initiated you buying the record, because it sounds like that memory is not quite there, but do you remember which song really permeated the culture in the Netherlands of those 3 big hits?
It was the first 2 that you mentioned, Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World, at least as far as I remember. Head Over Heels, I don't remember being a radio hit in the Netherlands, and it may have been, I think it's my favorite still after all these years. It was then, it still is now. It's such an incredible tune, and we can get into that more as well. But Shout was massive, and so was Everybody Wants to Rule the World. And
And when you were listening to it, like how aware were you of the fact? So you're a bass player, you're 16, so you're like I don't know what it is in the Holland, but here, or the Netherlands, but here that's roughly like sophomore year of high school, right?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
aware were you listening to the record of the overall production of maybe what they were using, and even more specifically the bass? Like, were you listening and going, man, it sounds like some of the songs are synth bass, some of the songs are live bass, some of the songs are both?
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting. My throughout my musical life, I've never been the kind of bass player that immediately gravitates towards bass in the music that I'm listening to, for one reason or another, and for better or for worse. And that's always been the case. And even when I do like composing work, it's often an afterthought. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
never am I tempted to be like, oh, I really get to like show my stuff. You know what I mean? It's like I don't care.
Yeah.
And
It's song
I mean,
first.
yeah, and I certainly obviously appreciate the bass and what it can do and what I can do and what people around me can do with it, but it's not necessarily something I gravitate towards when I first started listening to something, and I don't remember having any consideration of it at all when I listened to that music. It was holistic, you know
It
what I
was
mean? Like
the whole
yeah,
thing.
and if anything, I would say I gravitated towards the singing, and you know what I mean. Like they both have such amazing voices, and especially Roland Orzabal. I was I remember thinking like, what if you could sing like that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like what would that do to you? You know? And
Well, and people should know you sing a lot of backgrounds. I should
yeah,
have mentioned earlier, you're also playing with Richard Marx, who's fantastic, and you sing a lot of backgrounds with all of these different artists.
sure,
And I would
yeah,
imagine your sort of holistic approach to songwriting first, melody first,
yeah,
before anything else is the reason so many of these people want to work with you,
mm,
because it's so common to get isolated in a
right,
space of your own instrument and be obsessed with, not that gear's bad, but be obsessed with gear more than music,
right,
and your instrument more than the holistic, what is the person listening to this getting out of it?
right. Yeah, no, it's really true, and I have to check myself sometimes. You know what I mean? When I, especially when you're playing like established hits or something like that, and like somebody across the stage isn't doing it right. You know what I mean? I have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
sometimes have to be like, nope, not your place. And sometimes I'm unsuccessful, and I try to
well,
nudge them.
I get the same, I get the same way, but you also have a way of playing bass. Now, granted, a lot of times when I've played with you, I've been like, hey, can you bring the Hofner? Because I really, really, really love. And in fact, I think the first time you and I linked up was a recommendation. There you go,
Mhm.
by our mutual friend. I think it was Rich Hinman
Right.
that recommended you. I put on a bunch of events with my brother that were really fun. There were these cool events where like I put together music, and my
Yeah.
brother put together sort of local clothing artisans and vintage dealers. And
Yeah.
we put on these events where like you could buy these local artisans like hats, and you could buy their pants and shoes.
Yeah.
And there was also vintage dealers. But then I put together sort of these themed evenings of,
Right.
hey, we're going to pick an artist and play all their music instrumentally and do these like reinterpretations. When I was going to do the Paul McCartney set, or maybe was it McCartney or John Lennon? I
It
can't
was
remember.
definitely McCartney, or was it just Beatles?
I think it was, I don't even remember at this point.
Yeah.
But either way, no matter which one it was, Paul McCartney's playing bass on any of those songs. So
Yeah.
I hit up a mutual friend, Rich Hinman, who's an exceptional steel player and guitarist, and he recommended you.
Right.
And I think the reason he did that was because he understood. And if you people listen to the Weepies records, you can really hear why not do this. You can play melodically and slightly busier than somebody who's just playing diamonds and long notes
Right.
without ever getting in the way of the vocal and without ever getting in the way of the song. And you have this really cool thing where you're sort of combining the approaches of like a Jamerson and maybe Bob Babbitt, of a lot of movement without getting in the way, along with
Right.
somebody who maybe plays busy without getting in the way in a more melodic sense, almost with the vocal,
Right.
as Paul McCartney did.
Right.
And
Right.
that's something I've really noticed, that you know how to play more than just bum without getting in the way of the song. And that's something that's really rare in bass players. And Kurt
Thank you,
is
man.
really good at that on this
What's that?
record. Kurt is great on the Tears for Fears.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you say that, because I think that has been the result of a development that has lasted my entire musical life, which is and I've talked about this before, where the kind of music that I gravitated towards was almost flipped on its head, in that early in life, late teens, early 20s, I was into a lot of, fusion-y, modern jazz, not even modern jazz, but like fusion-y type stuff, right? Like really like playery, difficult stuff. And only discovered, Sly and the Family Stone, and really to a great extent, even like Stevie Wonder and the Beatles, when I was in college in Boston. And then upon moving to New York, that was another, sort of like life lesson and overall music lesson, where I just sort of like realized like what I appreciated in certain bass players that I wasn't doing, you know what I mean? Like really just like, just such a deep understanding of groove and where you place the note and where you end the note, you know what I mean? Like all those very super basic things, like, and I kind of went deep with that for a while, because I sort of, because I think I'd realized that with my changing musical tastes, I had gone too far into into sort of like, impressive playery direction. Not that I ever was one of those guys necessarily at all, but
that's a natural progression for a teenager too. Like I think a lot of people have that.
Exactly.
Phase.
And I kind of just went deep in my New York days, and I sort of, I it's not even a conscious decision I made, but I basically decided to just play, like really play for the song and really play simple. And I think I did that for like a good number of years. And then at some point, a buddy of mine, a drummer in New York, his name was Ethan Eubanks, and he was, my like we were joined at the hip when I was in New York, right? We played so many gigs together, and a great friend of mine to this day. And at some point he said something sort of offhand. He was like, because we were talking about this concept, right? And he's like, yeah, I kind of wish that every once in a while you would step out a little bit. You know what I mean? And I think I sort of took that as my cue, like, all right, like, I think maybe I've done enough time in this particular box, and now it's time to kind of explore again, right? And create a sound of your own, because that's a little hard to do when you really only play like the most functional of bass.
Yeah, I want to, before we move on to a couple things, I want to address this one thing that you said there that I've got a sort of a good story about, and I think it's something people really, really, really need to focus on as musicians, and gets vastly overlooked, and is important on guitar, but I would say is even more important on bass. When you come off a note.
Yeah.
Nobody ever talks about it. It's always like you come in on the and of two or whatever. Nobody's ever talking about when do you leave the note.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first joined Shania's band, this would have been like 2012, the bass player, Andy Sishan, who now he was playing with Billy Joel at the time, but is now playing exclusively with Billy because he just couldn't manage both gigs. Sure. But Andy worked with Shania in the 90s. So he was there when Mutt was there a lot. And I remember him telling me a story. I can't remember the exact story, but it was something along the lines of they're playing Still the One. And that bass part is so simple. It's just like boom, boom. That's it. But the point that Mutt would make was, I want you to come off that note as close as you can possibly get it before that snare hits. But I want you off the note completely
when the snare
or the snare.
Right. Yeah.
I want it to lead up just like, nuts to butts. And then as soon as it's about to hit, you're off. So we can really get the crack of this, because especially that song's like a brush song. So you really want to hear that, the brush, because you're not going to hear a big crack like a normal snare, and it can get swallowed by the bass really easily.
Yeah.
And I remember him telling me that story, and I'm like, dude, granted, I was like, I think 20 or something at the time, but I had done a decent amount of playing, and I was like, I've never heard anybody talk about that. And it was sort of mind blowing to be like, it took me getting on this gig and having a private conversation after reading guitar magazines for the last 8 years, all day and
Right.
night, and nobody's ever mentioned this.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it's especially. I mean, I think this applies to literally every musician, right? No,
Yeah.
regardless of the instrument that they play. But I agree with you that it's massively important on bass. I had a moment like that on my last tour that I did with Natasha Bedingfield, where we were playing. I forget what the song was, but and again, not a same as your friend, like not a complicated bass line, but like I'd played it a certain way, and then at some point I just decided to like change one thing, and that thing was where I stopped the second note of that particular thing, and I could feel like how it changed the groove and how it lifted the groove up, and I could tell that the drummer was feeling it too, right? Like, and didn't know why, but like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
like it had such a deep effect on like what we were doing together and the wavelength that we were on. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the moment I really realized that effect on guitar is playing reggae rhythm.
Yeah.
Because when you listen to Bob Marley play pocket, like chank, reggae rhythm, it's all about how quickly you're off. And so it's almost inaudible, the chord. It's almost just a chank. But you want to hear just enough of the actual pitches, and then you're off.
Right.
And so I think that's such an important thing. But I think you're right. I love that progression of, I think the fact that you learn the technical facility as a teenager is so important. And it's really the reason that when you came back around to being able to open up a little bit, all of that was still there.
Right.
And I think that that's really important. I noticed that in myself, because I think there's times when I got super snobbish about like, man, I just want to play one note, man, like B.B. King. And like, I love that. But I also am grateful for sort of like the metal and hard rock stuff that I've done, because it allows me to be able to open up when you want, but it's your choice when you decide to do so.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the bass playing on this record, because I know you're saying you saw it very holistically, but at any point, because they isolated some of the bass tracks in that BBC documentary,
right?
And I was like, I think it's Head Over Heels specifically that they soloed. Was that right?
Yeah. I think you're right.
It's you can tell it's sort of a punk rock bass player. It's definitely not smooth by any means. But his playing and his melody that he plays, how it links up with the vocal for like little bits of the bass line is so absolutely sick. Yeah. Did you ever learn those note for note and be like, man, that's really cool? Or were you just listening?
Never. Never occurred to me. And in fact, only now I'm like, oh, right, the bass. You know what I mean? Like I regard it like I regard everything else about that record and what it means to me. But it's really just only like a little part of a much bigger whole. The only song off the record that I've ever played was "Everybody Wants to Rule the World," which for a while in my former band Harper Blinn, when we toured with Carey Brothers, that became like our cover towards the end of the set.
Oh wow!
And it was great, and he sang it so great, and that was such a gratifying band to play it with, because everybody had sort of like a perfect balance of honoring the song and really playing it like the record, yet that, you know what I mean, that having their individual sort of stamp on it as well. And it was a great one. But we do it where like the guitar solo was like the same guitar solo.
That's
like
amazing. That's amazing. I'm going to do something quickly to my phone. I'm going to pause the recording real quick. We'll be right back in. All right, here we are again. So Everybody Wants to Rule the World is such a fun song, but the weird thing about it on this record was it was really an afterthought. Like they really were not trying to promote this. I mean, it was a song, let's talk about it. So this was a song that it was just a couple chords that Roland kept playing in the studio on acoustic guitar, and nobody really cared about it all. He was just kind of like, whatever. And then I believe it was it Ian or the producer?
I think it might have been Chris Hughes, I think, who came up with the producer who came up with that sort of shuffle beat. And
because Roland didn't want to record it, and he had him basically put that 2-chord vamp down, and then he added a bunch of stuff on top of it.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that happens more often than not, right? Like rarely does anyone say like, and now we're going to write the hit, you know what I mean? And then they do, and then it's a hit, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's often how this goes, right? Where you have a thing and you think it sucks and you still think it sucks. Somebody else thinks it's worth giving it a try. And then you do, and then all of a sudden, like you turn a corner and you're like, oh wait, you know what I mean? This just became great.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of those songs.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that a song that, I mean, weirdly enough, I saw in some interviews that Roland actually says he still doesn't like the song. He's
Right.
like, I still don't like it.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious that it is still to this day probably their biggest song. I mean, you could maybe argue that Shout is close, but I think that probably people know Everybody Wants to Rule the World even more so.
I think so too, and especially like you don't really hear Shout on like a playlist anymore, and Everyone Wants to Rule the World for sure you do. You know what I mean?
Yes,
like,
yeah.
You'll hear that in like stores and stuff like that, and Shout not so much.
And Everybody Wants to Rule the World. I can't remember where I was reading it, but I think it was some artist talking about their love for this album. And somebody said like that needs to be on every like wedding playlist too. Like when you're partying after the it's like September, Earth, Wind and Fire, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Michael Jackson, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. It's just like one of those songs where like it clicks and everybody's on the dance floor losing their minds. But I think it definitely is a little bit more geared towards the United States. It seemed like, because it seems like the UK loved their sad boy stuff. Like they loved the sort of downtrodden. I mean, obviously that was such a big factor in British music. What was the scene like in the Netherlands in the 80s? Where, I mean, I know you were sort of young at that point, but looking around, by the time that this record made it on the radio, were they seen as sort of like a sad, I'm using sad boy just because new wave is too general of a term, but this sort of really emotional, almost Smiths type lyrics approach. What was the thought, or were people not even listening to the English? They were just like, I like this song.
No, I think that all of that stuff was huge in Holland where I grew up, and you're right. It was sort of this sort of like anti-macho thing, right? As for guys to sort of like indulge in and feel okay with, and being emotional and being sad and being bummed, and that sort of had its stamp on new wave and the synth pop of that era, and I think it was as big in Holland as it was in the rest of Western Europe, including the UK. And then this record sort of like, we can talk about that more, but it just sort of like they gave themselves permission to sort of like open up from that, right? Like both in terms of like intent and emotion and lyrical content, but also in terms of like their musical sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were like, no more rules. It doesn't all have to be synths. Not that the Hurting was all synths, but it was mainly synth, and with a bit of like acoustic guitar every once in a while, or or like a electric guitar solo. But like on songs from the Big Chair, they really gave themselves permission to kind of just take it anywhere it led them.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that lyrical content briefly, because it's interesting. A couple weeks ago when I interviewed Mike G for this, we talked about the Beach Boys' Friends record.
Right.
And it was weird because the timeline is so specific on that, where they had met the Maharishi like 6 months before releasing that record. And his effect on them and their approach to mindfulness meditation and transcendental meditation had a massive impact on the sound of that record. Like it wasn't addressing all the social craziness of the late 60s. It was like they were talking about, sort of like self-understanding, and it was a very calm record. It was sort of mirroring that. And interestingly enough, Tears for Fears went through a bit of that phase, but in a little bit of a different way, where they had both read Arthur Janov, I believe that's the pronunciation of his name, his Primal Scream book, which a lot of people know through John Lennon, who was, when it came out in 1970, John Lennon was sort of balls deep into that and was really into this Primal Scream therapy, and sort of had a hallelujah moment. And it seems like that had the same effect on Kurt and Roland from Tears for Fears. So the first record, The Hurting, based on, clearly the name is like, they're in the midst of depression. They're in the midst of this like angsty teenage depression, because I think that they were like literally like 18, 19 when that record was being made and put out.
Yeah.
And then Songs from the Big Chair is sort of a grappling with that and a step away from the pure hurt of being a teenager and sort of the acceptance they've garnered through this Arthur Janoff Primal Scream therapy.
Yeah.
It had a direct effect on the lyrics being somewhat more optimistic of like a future away from pain. And it seems like it's amazing how quickly like a book or a philosophy can affect an artist so deeply, just like with the Beach Boys.
Yeah, exactly. And for those guys, you know, who both have described their you know, fraught childhoods, and obviously the same went for John Lennon, right? And so to sort of like give yourself permission to hurt and to be able to talk about it and make art with it, you know what I mean? Like that must have been, you know, extremely liberating. By the way, to loop back to when we couldn't think of the third hit on The Hurting, I guess it was The Hurting.
Oh. Yes, you're right. Yes. Yeah. That's probably why, because we were saying it as part of the same sentence, and our brain just couldn't wrap around the closeness of those two things. Okay, you're right. That is, and I've really fallen in love with that record. And let's talk about that progression instrumentally, because they were a mod band, not Tears for Fears, but they were in a mod band called Graduate before.
Right.
Heavily influenced by early Who and the Kinks and a lot of other British mod bands from the 60s.
Yep.
And they heard Gary Newman,
right,
and his recordings, which were massive in England. I mean, they were big here, but they were really huge there. And they said that is what initiated them moving into this direction of synth-made music, because they could both play, like they were both like actual musicians. They could really play their instruments, and they had this transition. As you mentioned, they were using a lot of synths on The Hurting, but they opened up to not only the brand new synths of the age, because they were extremely cutting edge as far as their use of what they were using on the records from record to record. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, they were also open to bringing in guitar and live bass and a lot of these, and saxophone and a lot of these other elements that were not included on The Hurting, that I think really opened them up to a wider audience outside of people who were interested in British second invasion new wave music.
Yeah, and I actually think that the seeds for all that were on The Hurting, because like if you think of a song like Pill Shelter, when I listened back to it this past week, what jumps out at me the most is the acoustic guitar part, right? Which is such a hook. Ding 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 ding. You know what I mean?
Amazing how much of a hook that is. It's literally a strumming of a chord. It's like a basic cowboy chord, and it's a hook. It's amazing.
And it's a hook. And to me, it almost, if you think of, you know, synthesizer sounds to be sort of like tied to their era, which they are, right? It's hard to sort of get away from that, because they came up and then became so popular immediately. And it's not like a violin or something like that that's been around for centuries, and even a guitar too, right? And by now, an electric guitar too doesn't necessarily sound dated, because it's been around for as long as it has. And of course an acoustic guitar. And so I sort of feel like even then they realized like they needed to like use those elements both to sort of like widen the sonic palette of it, and also like inject some humanity into what could be like really sort of you know what I mean, like gridded, sterile, you know, because I mean, if you're programming synths with like sequencers and stuff like that, it can sound, exactly.
Yeah, and they moved even further away from the programming stuff on their records after Songs from the Big Chair, and moved even more towards a sort of natural analog live playing stuff, and that stuff is great too. But I think this record hit that spot where it's a perfect middle ground.
I agree, and you know what, I know two guys who are in the current touring band with Tears for Fears. My friend Doug Petty is the keyboard player, and then Charlton Pettis plays guitar. And Doug I've known for years. Like it's not like we're like buddies. Like I don't know him super well, but I know him well enough to hit him up. I hit him up last week, and I was like, hey, you know, I'm doing this thing with my friend Josh, and I just wanted to see if he had anything interesting to offer. You know?
Oh wow.
Yeah, and he said that that from, and obviously Songs from the Big Chair was before his time with the band, right? And but he knew that those guys, and especially Roland Orzabal, basically like had his imprint on every note that was played on that record, right? And you can hear that. And then after that, Sowing the Seeds of Love is when they kind of started opening it up and like inviting, like these,
the A-list British guys,
Pino
Robbie
Palladino, and like
McIntosh.
Monica Che, exactly.
Yep.
And to me, you lose something that by doing that they found, with starting with The Hurting and then Songs from the Big Chair, where it's basically like sort of like a unified, like a glue, like a sound.
Absolutely. I feel that way about the Stevie Wonder records. Like, people love Songs in the Key of Life, and I love that record, but I do not put it in the same sphere as Talking Book, Music of My Mind, Inner Visions, Fulfilling His First Finale, when Stevie was playing 80 to 90% of everything on the tracks.
Right. Yeah.
It just has a sound quality. You could achieve the sounds on Songs in the Key of Life easier than you can achieve an accurate reproduction of something off of Inner Visions for that exact reason.
Right.
There's something about the imprint of somebody having their hand. Like you said, Roland seems like he's the guy where even when somebody else wrote it, his hands were on it.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
Yeah. So how much did he mention any of the other gear? Because I know that on these records, it was like a lot of Yamaha DX7. There was a Fairlight. There was a Lindrum LM2. There was a couple other ones that I'm sort of spacing on, but it was a relatively limited amount of synthesizers and drum machines because they just belonged to Ian Stanley, the guy that they were working with. And they were, this is a home studio record, which is crazy because it sounds so grand.
Yeah, exactly.
They were just using what this guy, I mean, granted, he had good stuff and clearly had some money, but it wasn't like going to a massive studio and using everything.
And you're talking about The Hurting now, right?
No, I'm talking about well, really both of them, right? Because these were both recorded at Ian's place primarily, right?
Correct, and what you're describing, and by the way, I've only like learned this stuff and like researching this record now, right, for this purpose, which is really, really great, right? This is a record that I love so much, and all I knew is that I loved it, and to actually like dig into it and the history of it, it's extremely gratifying. But what I gathered was that Ian had all that stuff, and I think that Mad World and Pale Shelter and The Hurting, I think those were the first 3 demos that they made. And by demos, I mean, that's what ended up on the record, right? Because was it Polygram or something like that, right? Like they heard it and they were like, this is incredible. And then they put it on a record. So, and those guys were like barely in their early 20s, right? If
that, they might have been during the production process in like 19.
Yeah.
Because I think they started working with Ian when they were late 18, early 19, and then like they made. Yeah. But I know they re-recorded, and this goes back to the perfectionism of Roland. I know they re-recorded a lot of that stuff, and they also re-recorded from this record. Is it Mother's Talk?
Yeah, right.
Where they produced that several times and released one version, then another UK, British, or European version. Then the one that we hear in the States is a different version. And once again, Roland still says he doesn't like even the final version that much.
Right.
He's still like, weirdly enough, I mean, he's clearly a perfectionist, and I'm sure it partially led to the demise of the band in a certain extent. But it seems like he really was so on top of like wanting to get the exact sound that he even hates some of their biggest hits.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
But I think also it's probably fairly common, right? Yeah.
But it is, I think it is weird to hate a hit so much before it comes out. Like everybody wants to rule the world. Like I think a lot of people end up hating it because they're like, we have to play this song again. But he hated it before they released it, which is, I think, especially odd.
That's so good.
So, okay, let's talk about some of their influences on this and if they were in your life, because I did some reading. It sounds like there were a couple records that were really influential during this period for them. One of which was Talking Heads' Remain in Light. And it certainly to me sounds like the programming of the percussion in this record, Songs in the Big Chair, was exceptionally influenced by Remain in Light. Where were
Right.
you with Talking Heads? Had they made it over there to the Netherlands? Were you listening to them at roughly the same time you bought this record? Were they on the radio?
I personally wasn't, other than hits that they had, which I think was probably around the same time. So I was certainly aware of them and appreciated them and loved their big hits, but not didn't have any of their records. So not
Okay. What
yeah.
about the other record they mentioned that was a big record at this time was Peter Gabriel's third solo record?
Right. Which you can really hear, and I didn't know that at the time. And it's probably the same thing. I don't remember when I got So, but I know that it was after I got this one, and I forget when So came out. It was probably like
86.
86. That was
Yeah.
something like that. But yeah, just in terms of like the breadth of the songwriting, right, and the sonic palette, and I can see how they picked up on what he was doing before that. So yeah, I read the same things. I loved The Cure, but not enough to like own any of their records. And yeah, so I can't say that I was well versed in any of the sort of influences that they mentioned, but certainly how they just put it all together and made their own thing was what I latched onto.
Well, I think that that's an interesting bit about it. And it's interesting as somebody listening now, roughly for the first time, was it seems like they were able to transcend the time.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that 80s music has such a staple of the 80s to its detriment a lot of times. Yeah. Not always, but and I love some good 80s style production, and there's a lot of 80s records that I do like, but it's very easy, and a lot of the contemporaries of Tears for Fears have been forgotten because their music did not transcend the 80s. And I don't want to call anybody out, but there one of the other bands that I think was an influence, and they were probably a mutual influence that I'm curious if you listened then or now, is Talk Talk. Mm-hmm. It seems like Talk Talk is a band that people still really love now and is able to sort of escape in the same way, maybe not as far as on a popular culture spectrum, but at least for musicians that like 80s new wave synth pop music. Talk Talk, along with Tears for Fears, they're always still mentioned as bands that people are like, this still kicks ass in 2020, and it'll kick ass in 2050, it'll kick ass in 3050.
Yeah, I love Talk Talk, and to me the common thread with all the things that all those bands and all those artists that you mentioned, and including Tears for Fears, is that I think for a lot of artists and bands of the era, sort of like a disaffected, moody, detached thing was all the rage, right? Like God forbid that anybody thinks you care too much, you know what I mean? Or that is meaningful to you, or, you know what I mean? It's like, kind of like a blasé thing that I think was in vogue. And all these artists that we're talking about rejected that idea, and like talk about a band like U2, right? Who were massive in the 80s, but nobody thinks of them as an 80s band, and talk about a guy who puts everything into that vocal. Love him or hate him, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't say that there is not
I
emotion.
love U2. I love U2 and their early stuff especially, but I actually do like a lot of their later pop stuff. But you're right, like these bands basically gave a middle finger to the idea of trying to be too cool. Yeah. Which sort of came back with like slacker rock, like Weezer and Beck in the 90s. And obviously the grunge era was like, we don't care either. So there was a lot of that. This was a nice break from that, I think. The 80s new wave thing was like, we do care. We do cry, man. We do have emotions, man.
And here's the thing, like, anyone who knows me, like, I wouldn't characterize myself as a particularly emotional guy, right? But it still like spoke to me, right? Like I think the honesty of it spoke to me, and that's sort of what takes it out of any particular era, musically speaking.
Yeah. Well, and at the time, you were also just pulsing with hormones as a teenager, where you're like, you know what I mean? Like, that's a time when like boys are like, they're essentially monsters. You know what I mean? Like, they're like, man, they're like, your body's just freaking out.
What's happening?
And that style of music, I mean, I think I went the other way when I was a teenager. I went towards angry punk rock metal. Mm-hmm. So instead of getting into like the emo and more emotional stuff and diving into that, I was just like, duh! And like got into like Lamb of God and, all that type of, Megadeth and Slayer and Pantera and all those types of bands.
Amazing.
But yeah, I think you sort of choose a path and then eventually you can come full circle. Well, is there anything else before we move on to your second record that you want to say about Tears for Fears, its effect on you, or anything that we missed at all that maybe you talked with your friend about, any other tidbits of any other things that he said about Roland or working with Roland and Kurt, or in his process of reproducing the sounds from the record?
Oh, one little fun factoid that he told me was that in was it Shout? You know what? I'm gonna look it up because it was a fun little.
While you're looking that up, there are some very cool guitar solos in this record, which I would not say is like the reason to listen to the record, but I'm trying to remember which songs. I think is it Shout or Mother's Talk, or also the Everybody Wants to Rule the World, the double stop rhythmic solo in the middle is so kick-ass and so memorable and so different and not. I have a real hard time with bad blues rock guitar playing because I spent so much time in the blues and classic rock, blues rock guitar world. When I hear somebody do it with a sense of mediocrity, it drives me insane, and it really drives me away from the music. I can't help it. And I love that that's not where they went with the guitar solos in this record at all. They went for an angular rhythmic thing rather than just blues soloing.
Yeah. To me, and and this is a great thing, and I think I was trying to find a way to talk about this, and you just gave it to me, which is that to me, all of their parts, like all of it, they are meant to be parts. They're not like the guitar solo isn't meant to be a guitar solo. It's meant to be a part that could be played on the guitar, but it could also be played on like a chimey bell type synth,
totally,
or a grand piano for that matter, or all of them, and they did, right. And I think that's what I like. For instance, that song "The Working Hour" on
so good.
It's so good, and it wasn't a huge hit, so I think most people don't know it. But like, I was trying, like every time I put it on, I realized that I love it. And here we have this thing here, right? So like it's basically like a G and a D, right? So like, I could just play these two notes. That's the whole verse.
So simple.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it had a massive impact on how I view music, and how I like we were talking about before, how I try to fit the bass into the thing, like to change the tonality of a song or a verse based on what I play over a static thing. There's actually like a Weepies song where I did that where I play something entirely different on the first verse from the second verse. Totally different bass line, and it totally changes the character of those two verses, but what's going on other than my bass line is the same.
Which is interesting, because usually people apply in a second verse a new guitar part,
right?
It's not usually a new bass part, that because anybody who works in a production sense, there's always like, we have to make the second verse somehow different. It either needs it needs a pad now, it needs a big a 12 string strumming on the downbeat of whatever. There's a million ways to do it. Rarely is that case the bass, and I think that's very cool that you were able to see that and realize that could be the variant between the verses.
Yeah, and it's as a bass player, it's very empowering. You know what I mean? Like we're supposed to sort of be at the back of the stage and not call any attention to ourselves anyway. Yeah, and so like having that, like realizing that that's a power you have is kind of amazing. And I think that even if I certainly wouldn't have been able to articulate that back in the day, or why I love this record, or what influence it had on me. Like I think a record like that did shape me very, very in a very real way. You know what I mean? Where like music isn't just like, here's the drum part, here's the bass part, and then the guitar player is going to play the chords. You know what I mean? Like it's you can get much more creative than that. I've heard it said about James Brown's music that every instrument is a percussion instrument, right? The horn stabs are like it's a percussion instrument, and the guitar and the bass, and I feel like with a band like Tears for Fears, like every instrument is a parts instrument, and
Yes.
and any instrument can play the part, including the drums, right? Like
Totally.
accent certain things, and in the way those things are put together, all of a sudden there's this tapestry of a song, and it's not necessarily like, and now the verse, and now the chorus, and now the middle eight. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's much
absolutely.
more.
And there's a lot of songs that the bass does the opposite thing, and it ends up gluing everything together, where there's movement amongst all the other chords and the bass stays static on the root note. And sometimes when things end up feeling too busy, a bass player ends up being like, I'm just going to stay on the one and I let everybody else move around me. There's so many songs where that is the case, and that's the glue that holds everything together.
Yeah.
And I like that you can approach it from either end, where it's like, I'm going to be the stationary static member, or you can do what you did on the Weepies song and be the variant that's changing. That's right. What I love. And that's what I love about bands, because I think so many session players, due to the fact that it's part of their job description, they have to understand a lot of the basic sort of like, this is what people do to get X. This is what people do to vary X. And then you get people like Roland from Tears for Fears, or like Trent Reznor, that are like, F all of that. I'm going to make this thing be the thing that changes the song, and all the hand claps and cowbells, that shit's out the window. I'm going to completely flip it on its head. And I think that people that don't work in the session world sometimes end up coming up with ideas that are more individualistic. And you can definitely hear that. And I think that's what you mentioned as a sort of final note, as where they ended up going. Not that their music wasn't good after this record, but there is somewhat of a loss of that fingerprint on every part being able to be played like that. After this record.
The thing you just mentioned with the Weepies, and I think the way in which I collaborated with the Weepies had a lot to do with that, which is essentially that we collaborated remotely, and it was the first like they sort of got me on the path. I was on tour. I visited them in LA. I recorded a couple songs with them because I knew, Steve from the Weepies from back in New York. And then the tour bus left the next morning, and they called me that night after I had been over to their place to record some songs, and they asked me if they wanted me to do the rest of the record. And that's when the M-Box had come out, right? Pro Tools. Essentially the first sort of portable audio interface.
What year would this have been roughly?
But it would have been like 2005, and I had flirted. I'm not saying that's when it came out, but it was certainly the first time that I had seriously considered it. So they bought me an M-Box, and I did the record from the road, the rest of the record from the road, right? And then consecutive records or tracks that I did for them, I did from wherever I was living in New York. All of that to say, of course, there's nothing like being in a room with people and vibing off each other and like, you know what I mean? Like bouncing around ideas and like being quick with it. But one of the advantages of recording remotely is that it's just you for a minute, right? For as long as you have to like deliver this track. And if somebody's not in an incredible hurry, which generally they're not, they're like, do your thing and just let me know when it's done. You can go down a rabbit hole of an idea for a while and try something out, put it away, sit with it, come back to it the next morning, be like, oh, this is really working, this isn't working. You know what I mean? And like flesh out an idea. Whereas if you were in a room with a producer and you tried something that was a little bit odd or a little bit strange, or like I said, like the first verse isn't like the second verse, they might just shoot it down, just goes like, oh no, let's when you play something like this, and there's nobody to tell you that, so you kind of just follow your idea until you're happy with it and you're done, and then you send it back, and it has a much greater chance of surviving that way. And so with the Weepies, I think I was able to sort of create these little bass universes within those songs, not to overstate what I did, but you know what I mean? Like I had the time to chase down ideas, and that's I
love that. Do you want to just briefly, before we move on to your second record, which Weepies records are those? Because I think that people really should, and I'll overstate it for you. I think the bass parts on those records are absolutely essential to the records, and they're a big part of of the songs, and they're a big part of the overall sound of the production. So I'll overstate it for you. But what are the records called so people can go find those without searching down your All Music page?
The first one I did was "Say I Am You," and I didn't do the whole record. There's a couple of other guys on it, and I think I did about half of the tracks on that. And then the next one was "Hideaway," and I did that entire record. And I think the song that I was talking about, just in case you're curious about like the the first and the second verse being different, and sort of like like an example of how you can shape a tune as a bass player, is called Antarctica. And okay. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, I know I'm going to be diving in and going and rechecking that out to make sure I can hear it. But yeah, I hope everybody else does the same thing. Well, here we are. Now we're going to move on to your second record, which is Mother's Finest Live, which came out in 1979, I believe.
Yeah.
And this is a band that I don't think ever heard of. Maybe they had been mentioned by people in magazines, and I'd heard their name because it sounds vaguely familiar, but it's weird because this music is sort of right down my alley, and especially the music I was listening to in my, like, a lot of teens, like sort of after the metal punk rock period, was this like heavy funk rock music. And so this is where I really want to get into the European side, and specifically the Netherlands. How that affected it, because this was a band from Georgia. It had a following in the United States, but not a radio following. They had their own sort of personal following of people that would go to their shows. And they opened for the absolute biggest artists on the planet. They opened for The Who. They opened for Aerosmith. They opened for Black Sabbath. They opened for AC/DC. They opened for Ted Nugent.
Earth, Wind & Fire.
Earth, Wind & Fire. They opened for so many people. And I would imagine, based on this record, a band that made sure the final act gave it every single lick of energy they had, or they'd get buried by their opening act. Because these guys, I'm really glad you picked this live record, because having listened to their studio records, it seems like one of those bands, they never captured themselves in the studio the way that they could live. So when did this record come into your life? What was your understanding of them in popular culture in sort of Germanic countries, or that sort of general area?
Right.
Just give me that breakdown.
I think, and I could be wrong about this, I should ask my brother, because my brother and I, every once in a while, one of us would come up on a record and love it, and we'd both really get into it. And I don't remember if this was him or me, but part of what we did is go to the library, and you could borrow LPs. I
did the same thing, but you actually borrowed vinyl.
Yeah. Because
I did that with CDs in the early
but this is before CDs. And so every once in a while we go to the library, get a couple of records, and if we loved them, we taped them, and then you'd have the cassette, and that was that.
Wow.
And and I did own this record, but I'm pretty sure that I bought it after the fact. This is all pretty murky. I think it might have happened that way. It's also possible that I went to a like used record store in Amsterdam, where when I was in college there, and just found it and loved. Because I mean, if you look if you look at the cover, it's irresistible, right? It's like. Sure. It's like a Kiss record, which is another, like at some point. By the way, I just wanted to I hadn't thought about this, which is that I'm glad that I ended up on this record, because at some point when you and I were talking about this, I'd considered picking Kiss Alive 2, which I was so bananas over when I was like 9 years old. I couldn't believe it, and I was like, this is the best thing that has ever existed on planet Earth.
Of course.
But I kind of realized like live records are really important to me and to my musical history. And like certain records that my parents had, that there were certain artists that we could all in our family, like family vacations across Europe, right? Get in the car, go do a summer in whatever, France or something like that. Yeah, and there were certain kinds of music that we could all agree on to play in the car. And ABBA, Queen, Elton John, he's got a live record called Here and There, I think it's called, and I love the record. I almost picked it for this conversation, but I kind of realized like I'm big on live records. There's something about them that I think propelled me to do what I do today.
I can completely see that. And also, live records are extremely important to me, but I started playing the year before YouTube came out.
Okay.
So my sort of live record, I had a lot of live records, but a lot of it, sometimes when people are like, what's your favorite record by this band? And I'm literally like, it was a YouTube upload.
Yeah, right.
I watched over and over again.
Yeah.
But I had that same inclination. It was just like we talked about with CDs versus LPs. It was just a different way of receiving the information.
Yeah.
But I can see that, especially with a band like this, and there's something about hearing the cohesiveness of a live unit playing songs from disparate records that had different production styles, were recorded in different eras.
Yeah.
But I think I would say Kiss is maybe a band similar to this, where I'm not a Kiss guy. Right. And it's not a knock on Kiss. I do know Kiss Alive. I think the first Kiss Alive, is that the one with Black Diamond on it?
I believe so.
So there's this weird thing, and let's talk about Kiss, because you did mention that record, because everybody I know that's roughly around your age, that's a rock musician, session musician now, was fucking bananas about Kiss.
Yep.
But I think it had so much to do with being a kid and seeing, especially pre-social media and all this shit, these people are like superheroes, superstars, like aliens playing music, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And for people that have or hear Kiss way after they were culturally super relevant, they don't have that same connection, and it just ends up looking sort of goofy.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting actually is that, you know, I discovered them, and Kiss I definitely discovered through my brother. I will credit him for this, but I had kind of a way to like co-opt things once he discovered them for me. But we were both crazy about Kiss. But other than like the actual record covers and like some magazines or something like that, like we didn't like I never saw them move. You know what I mean? Like,
oh wow.
Like I certainly didn't. I never saw them live. It didn't even occur to me that was an option. You know what I mean? Like, even though I suppose it could have been, but like, what? No.
Maybe in the Netherlands, or they definitely played Germany.
I mean that they would have around that time.
Yeah.
But they weren't on TV other than like a little bit later again when they had sort of like more mainstream hits. But I never saw them move, and so it was just like these pictures, and I did. I don't know if I ever loved any of their studio records either, but I loved their live records. And I read something interesting about it recently, which is when I realized like I have a thing for live records. With the Kiss live records, it's well known that they re-recorded, fixed, you know what I mean? Most of it.
Had
like,
other players come in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I read something about, and I forget if it was Paul Stanley or Gene Simmons who said it, but their argument, they didn't deny it or excuse it at all. They basically said if you're at a concert, it's everything. It's, you know what I mean? There's no escaping it. It's the sound, it's the volume of the sound, it's the lights, it's the sweat, it's people like pressed up against you, everybody's going crazy, everybody's screaming. Like it's about an as immersive an experience as you can have. And when you put on a live record, how is that supposed to compete with it?
Sure.
And so he was like, so we put cannons on it. Like they had recordings of cannons that they put on the live record. And like reels of audience. I think Peter Frampton Comes Alive is like a famous for having these like recorded audience sounds that have been used on countless live records since then. And so they would just add to it, you know what I mean, to sort of give this feeling of like of being in it. And you know what, that makes perfect sense to me.
Look, if as long as they aren't lying about it and sort of obfuscating it, I have no problem with it at all. And clearly they're their best records. Like, here's another band that I think falls into this category. And speaking of, you just mentioned Peter Frampton. His solo career, I think Frampton Comes Alive is actually another good example of this, but his previous band, Humble Pie, I love. They're one of my favorite classic rock bands ever. And you know what their best record is, hands down? Rockin' the Fillmore live.
Yeah.
It had some good studio stuff. Like Smokin' is cool. Absolutely nothing they ever did competes with Rockin' the Fillmore. It fucking rocks. It is the quintessential. If I was like, hey, does somebody want to hear Peter Frampton on guitar playing kick-ass songs, sing a couple of them, but then also hear Steve Marriott just crushing vocally? I think it's another band, just like Mother's Finest, just like Kiss. You could argue Peter Frampton's solo career, same thing. His best record is Frampton Comes Alive by far.
Yeah.
And there's just some people that they never are able to capture the live energy in a studio setting. And there's other bands the other way around that they were not great live and they were a studio creation. I think you could probably make the argument, as good as Tears for Fears sounded live,
I was just going to say,
there's no fucking way they could have done Songs for the Big Chair in that and get that same effect live. There's just no way.
Right.
And I watched some videos. They sounded good, but it's not even close. And then I think it's interesting with Kiss. It's such an interesting thing. I remember trying to get into Kiss because Dimebag Darrell was such a big fan, and I was a massive Pantera fan. He had the Kiss sticker on his like blue Dean guitar. Maybe it was a Washburn. I can't remember. I think it might be a Dean. No, I think it's a Washburn. Whatever. Somebody will correct me and be an asshole to me online. But I remember knowing that and going and listening to it and being like, trying with all of my might to like it. And I did like Black Diamond is cool. There's a couple songs. And I actually think I Want to Rock and Roll All Night Long is actually a great song. And there's some cool, interesting musical shit. But it just isn't the same when you're not a kid growing up being like you were, where you're like, these guys seem literally otherworldly.
Literally. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yep. Like, and I was, like I said, I was 9. I was primed for it.
Yeah, that's the perfect age where you're still into like superheroes. You're getting into music. Yep. It's sort of the coalescence of all that. Well, let's bring up Mother's Finest then. So, this stuff, it absolutely kicked ass, and I can imagine them opening for. I mean, the amount of divergence opening up for Sabbath and AC/DC, but also Earth, Wind, and Fire is amazing, and you can hear that all in their music. When you were listening, how did you take this in? Because you mentioned the very holistic approach you took to Tears for Fears. How was your digestion process with this Mother's Finest live? Or you just maybe talk about that for a second?
Well, for some reason, and I don't really know why this is, but the intersection of funk and rock, Holland is fertile ground for it. And why, I do not know. But like, if something is funky, but also like kicks ass in the way that rock does, people over there eat it up, and I did, you know what I mean? And I do to this day, and I'm not sure why. But I mean, it's just so, and you know, I'm sure a lot of people, if people watch this for the first time without actually like listening to it first, they have no idea what we're talking about, and you will once you put that record on, right? Because it's outrageous how funky it is, and I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have had the wherewithal to pick up on like what it would have meant for a band out of the U.S. South to be mixed race, right? The band was mostly black, and the drummer and the guitar player were white, and they you know, and it was a lot of people have called it the first black rock band, you know, the way they were melding funk and rock was really revolutionary, and ultimately probably is what kept them from really breaking through, right? Because
it sounds like that was the case. And I listened to, in fact, a shout out to Craig from Everyone Loves Guitar, who I've done an interview on his show. Have you been on his show?
No.
You should. I'll link you guys up. Fantastic podcast, Everyone Loves Guitar. Craig interviewed Spider, the bass player, and he was talking about it, where he was like, sorry, what?
Wizard.
Why did I say Spider? Sorry, Wizard. The spelling, I don't know. Wizard. My bad. Yeah. I think I was seeing the Wizard with the Y, and then Spider.
Yeah.
But his interview, he was talking with him, and he was like, Europe did not have the same inclination for separating black music and white music on the radio. Right. And they were talking where they were like, when it was just AM, pre-FM radio, in the States, you could hear Sly and the Family Stone right next to you know, Led Zeppelin or,
Yeah.
or whatever, Van Morrison or anything
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And once things shifted to FM
Yeah.
and things really started to diverge, they
Yeah.
were stuck only in the US between this weird place where they were, and they've said this a million times, they were too rock for black radio and they were
Yeah.
too funk for white radio.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's insane to think like how recent that was and how insane that is as a,
Yeah.
it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
But because of the completely different racial landscape and history of racism in Europe, it was not the case, which is why the Netherlands were able, and like you mentioned, Germany was also another hotbed for their music. And they just weren't able to ever break through in the States. Like I said, they had their fans and they opened for the biggest artists, rock artists and funk and soul artists in the world.
Yeah.
But in Europe, they were completely accepted for who they were, and people just absolutely ate it up. And it's so strange that they were this, it wasn't like a Hendrix thing where they were a United States act that broke in Europe and subsequently that broke them in the United States. That's what happened with Hendrix.
Yeah.
That same thing never happened. They broke in Europe and it never transferred over to the US.
Yeah. And one thing that I'd recently learned in sort of researching this record a little bit, was, and I didn't know this, but there was I didn't know that this is what broke them in Europe. There was a show in Germany called Rockballast, which was a very famous concert, like concert show on TV in Germany that was broadcast kind of, I think, throughout Western Europe and certainly in Holland as well. And there's several Rockballast concerts that I remember. My brother taped one that Pete Townsend did when he sort of had his solo project. Yeah, it's like with David Gilmour on guitar and Simon Phillips on drums, and it's got like power horns. It's outrageous.
I gotta find that because the Little Feat Rockballast is, I think, the best available video and audio of Little Feat in a video setting ever.
Wow. Yeah.
And they did such a great Rockballast is essentially what has really created this amazing thing of like, they have the best audio and video footage of a lot of bands, particularly American bands.
Yeah.
Were not filmed in America.
Yep.
And this goes not via Rockballast, but Europe has a lot of the best footage because they had an appreciation for particularly a lot of the Black American artists.
Yeah.
That they filmed and recorded Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker and all these people that in the States, there's very little footage of them at all.
Yeah.
And in Europe, that's essentially where all the footage came from, in particularly the 60s. But then once Rockballast started, I think in the 70s, almost all the best footage for these different bands, Pete Townsend solo, Little Feat, Mother's Finest. I know there's a couple other that have been, there's a great Bonnie Raitt one where I think the best performance of I Can't Make You Love Me exists from Rockballast. So it's amazing how culturally relevant with YouTube that show has sort of reemerged as.
Exactly. Yeah. Because I was talking to a German buddy of mine here in LA and he sent me, a link to the Rockballast stuff, which I actually don't recall if I'd ever seen it. And it's amazing. And from what I read, like that put them on the map in Europe and it gave them their following. That single concert that went out on TV, that's what made them be able to tour up to this moment in Western Europe. And
they're Ed Sullivan show.
Basically, yep. And if I'm not mistaken, one of them, and I forget if it's Glenn Murdoch, the singer, or somebody else, but lives in either in Holland or Western Germany or something like that. Yeah, it's that's fascinating. And I will say this to anybody that wants to hear this live record, they should go listen to the actual live record. But I highly recommend going and finding the Rockballast show on YouTube because it was, I think, recorded the same year. It was maybe released at a different time, but it's essentially the same exact set as the live record. Right.
And you get to actually see them in action. So I would recommend if you're going to go listen to on whatever streaming platform you use, listen to the record live.
Yeah.
Go watch the Rockballast show because you really get an idea of like just how insane their outfits were and how utterly 70s and awesome it is.
Yeah.
And how this mixed race band is just like having a fucking blast, dude. Like they are having so much fun. It's ridiculous. I love it.
Ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And here's the other thing that I didn't really know. You know, we were talking about a band like Kiss, sort of like re-recording. You know what I mean? Like we had a live record. We're just gonna like fix everything. And I'm not saying that they didn't fix anything, but when you watch that footage of the Rock Blast show, you realize like that was their show. Yep. Like that's how fucking good they were. Mm-hmm. And it's frightening.
Yeah,
they were so like vocally, and you know what I mean. It's like it's amazing. And then like on the German TV show, you kind of realize like, oh, there's like a synth that's actually out of tune, or you know what I mean. And it's kind of like they would have fixed that if this were a live record, and I'm sure that they did. But like the more than the essence, like really like what they were able to do live as a band is what is on that record, and it's incredible.
Yeah, I'm sure they only went back and fixed like technical malfunctions or like super obvious stuff because you're right. They do sound almost identical when you listen to the Rock Palace show and the actual live show. Yeah, audio is obviously a little bit better on the record because it was like mixed and mastered in a probably more obsessive capacity than the Rock Palace show. But it really is an interesting mix because when you look at the history of sort of maybe not like mixed race bands necessarily, but hard rock and funk didn't really exist. There were bands that included rock and funk, like Sly and the Family Stone and Jimi Hendrix and people like that, where it was clearly the psychedelia was there. But as far as hard rock, people being influenced by Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, that was not really the case. Like a lot of those late 60s bands were more part of a psychedelia, like fuzz guitar craziness, like when you listen to Band of Gypsies, which is, I think, my favorite live record of all time, along with the Allman Brothers Fillmore concert. But it's not the same as hard rock and funk. And Parliament dabbled in it Funkadelic more so dabbled in it. But even that was not as influenced by, like, I don't think, maybe I could be wrong, I don't think the guys in Funkadelic were legit listening to Black Sabbath.
Right.
They might have been listening to Zeppelin, maybe like Jeff Beck Group, which is actually super heavy for like 67. But I don't know if they were listening to like Sabbath, straight up metal. Yeah. And you could tell that there's an actual influence. And Wizard, not Spider, talks about it in that interview where he's like, we opened for Sabbath and we love Sabbath. He's like, we were into it. And I think that although they weren't the first funk rock band, they were the first funk soul hard rock band, which I think is an important distinction because that there is a difference tonally and rhythmically from something that's more Sly and the Family Stone, Hendrix-esque.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because, you know, when we're talking about hard rock, what we now call hard rock as it existed in the 70s, you listen to it now and you're like, it's not that hard, right?
Yeah, when bands like Pantera exist or Lamb of God or
right.
Whatever.
Hey, by the way, I'm gonna I have to plug in my my computer real quick. Can we pause for 2 seconds?
Yes, let's do that.
So that what we now consider, you know, hard rock as it existed in the 70s, like it wasn't really that hard, and it was actually kind of like I think of Led Zeppelin as kind of as a groovy band. You know what I mean? Yeah, that is a funky band. When you know what Bonham and John Paul Jones did is actually like it's really groovy. And Mother's Finest, even though they melded funk and rock, it's still mostly funky.
Exactly.
As like in that particular era. And then it's got what for the time was probably like heavy guitar, but he's still just kind of playing a Strat, right? Like,
yeah, I think he had a humbucker in there though, but you're right. Like it is essentially a Strat. And weirdly enough, I mean, speaking of Black Sabbath, I mean, that first record was a Strat.
Okay.
Because I believe his SG pickup went out or something like that. And I think there might've been, or no, wait, was it the other way around? I think they recorded most of it with a Strat. The pickup went out and he brought in the SG.
Oh, wow.
That's the way it is. But the interesting thing is you listen to the first Sabbath record, and other than the song Black Sabbath, it's kind of a blues rock band. Like honestly, the first record, I'm like, dude, Zeppelin is just as heavy as the first Sabbath record, but then very quickly they started down tuning, playing sludgier. They started playing heavier.
Yeah.
And you're right. Like, there's not a bunch of down tuned tritone, super sludgy shit that like Sabbath was doing that Mother's Finest wasn't doing that. But there was sort of that factor of hard rock that was more like power chord stuff that somebody like Hendrix just didn't really do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He's playing more like dominant chords and sort of double stops. He's not playing like a lot of just straight up power chords moving around.
Right. Exactly.
Mother's Finest being influenced by like the Who and like, you know, probably not AC/DC yet, but
Zeppelin for sure. In fact, for Mickey's Monkey, which is on the record, they basically like lifted that riff off of Custard Pie, right? And
that really caught me off guard. I was like, wait, what the F is going on? Like I was threw me off for a second.
And I think the record that Mickey's Monkey was on was like 2 years after Custard Pie or something like that. So like they you know what I mean? Like they clearly just heard that and was like, that's cool. Let's write a song.
And
Zeppelin,
they're really changing it.
No, not at all. And Zeppelin, like, they didn't sue them probably because Zeppelin was like, well, we stole all this shit too. So you know what I mean? Like,
that's a bad precedent.
A little hypocritical.
Especially the first record, like Zeppelin eventually really, that's why my favorite Zeppelin stuff is like Physical Graffiti era. But their first record, you're right. It's just like mostly like Willie Dixon songs that they basically repurpose. So it set a bad precedent.
It's a little much, right?
They made the right move by not doing that. But it is weird because it is like Custard Pie is a very specific, it's not like a blues riff. It's like a very specific, rhythmically dense riff. Yeah. Now, they changed the rhythm section under it, but the guitar riff is literally Custard Pie, front to back. They even do, it's not even just the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's the whole like circuitous riff. It's like a, I don't know, 24 bar section. They just lift it.
Yeah.
But hey, you know what? More power to them. It worked live and people clearly liked it. So,
you know, if they ripped off those white boys, I think everybody is okay with that based on.
Well, let me ask you this, because I'm curious. Like, I know you mentioned with Tears for Fears, there was a more holistic approach. Yeah. By the time you heard Mother's Finest, how much were you listening to Wizard's bass playing and being like, oh, okay? Or was it once again, Whynot in his like, I really only listened to the whole record and never really pieced apart the individualistic instruments?
It's a good question. I mean, his bass playing is definitely, it's very prominent. He was a thumb player, and when I say that, like he wasn't like a slapper as a lot of like, you know, players around the, but it was, you know, it was the late 70s. So if anything, it was like a Larry Graham, where he mostly just, where by default he played with his thumb. And so it's a very prominent and you know, very rhythmic sound, but not in the way that we think of like what slap bass sort of turned into, sort of a character of itself.
It's even less than the like halfway slapping that like Chuck Rainey did on Steely Dan.
Right, exactly.
Sort of a middle ground too, where it's like, it's not slapping and it's not thumping. It's sort of like you have slapping over here, thumping over here, and you have what Chuck Rainey did.
Right.
On, was it Peg?
Yeah.
On Peg, where it's sort of like in the middle. This is sort of like the very, it's, I think the thumping thing, it's hard to make cheesy. Like you have to do it in a really out of context way. Like it actually just sounds very cool and big. It doesn't
really
sound
cool.
like,
Yeah, exactly. And sort of like just like in your face enough. And but again, you know, to what you just suggested, like it's true. Like I think I latched on the drummer, you know, his name is Barry Borden, and you know, like they all have nicknames, of course, Wizard, right? The drummer's BB Queen. And
wait, Wizard's not his birth name?
Oh God. Give it away.
Why? I wish that was his birth name. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hey, man, you never know. I don't know, and I actually have a funny story about that too. We'll get to that.
Yeah, and he does have 12 siblings, so they might have just been like, I don't know, call him Wizard.
Oh, Wizard.
Exactly. Y.
Yeah, he's got a cape on. Yeah, and you know, I latched onto the drummer just as much because BB Queen is an incredible drummer, and he sort of had that, you know, like a busy style, but because it was the 70s, the drums are like super dead, and he's a badass. And then of course like Joyce Kennedy on, you know, they had two singers, Joyce Kennedy, Glenn Murdoch, who eventually married, who eventually had a kid, who eventually became their drummer
Oh,
back in
wow.
much later in the 90s.
Yeah.
And anyway, yeah, Joyce Kennedy is just like out of this world
It
talented singer.
sounds like if Aretha Franklin sang in a hard rock funk band.
Yeah,
You know what I
exactly.
mean? Not all the vocal tonality, but the sort of like you could tell she comes from the church.
Yeah,
It's the church singing, and it sounds like if you're like, "Hey Aretha, go sing with this like killing loud ass hard
yeah,
rock band," and it's got that church thing, but she has the cut through
yeah.
point in like the EQ of her vocal that cuts through all these distorted instruments.
A bit like Shaka Khan, you know what I mean? Where it's like really pointed but just such a range, and talk about emotion in a vocal, you know what I mean? Christ.
Kick ass.
Yeah, so to me it was all of it, you know what I mean, and just how well they groove together, and I think even though, like I said, I wouldn't have been able to sort of like pick up on the racial implications of their band in the US South. I wouldn't have really known, other than on the sort of like the most theoretical level. I still think it meant something to me, you know what I mean, like looking at those guys on a record cover, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
it's still affirming in some like really fundamental way that I think I understood, and yeah, so um
Well, at that time, where were you as far as like the other bands that we've mentioned? Like, were you already listening to The Who? Were you listening to Sabbath? Were you listening to Zeppelin? Were you listening to Hendrix? Like, where did this band come in? Were they a gateway back to that stuff, or was it the other way around, where like you had sort of prepped your palette with this, maybe not hard rock, but like rock, funk, late 60s, probably early 70s type stuff? Because there was a significant amount of it. I mean, a band like Humble Pie would
yeah,
fall into that category. Even a band like Free was actually very funky, especially for like a British rock band that was very
yeah,
pocket oriented. But I'd say Mother's Finest with the drumming, like you said, being a little busier. It seems like he was actually more influenced by maybe Keith Moon, Mitch Mitchell, and Bill Ward than he was
yeah,
by somebody who's just a pocket player. Although he played a lot of pocket, you mentioned there's definitely some movement there as well.
yeah. You know, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of music that I came to at that age, largely based on sort of like how we had access to music, right? Which is a lot, a lot less broad than what exists right now. It feels like what I latched onto was almost accidental in a lot of ways, and so a lot of the bands that you mentioned I didn't really discover until later. Or like if I knew the Who, it's because somebody gave me a 45 of I Can See for Miles, I think, or something like that. I don't even really remember what it was.
You weren't introduced
Anyway,
to
so
like Live at Leeds, like their early sort of like progression
no,
to being the Who.
all of that came later. I know that I loved Earth, Wind, and Fire right around that time. I had a bunch of their records. Um, I loved funk music in all the forms that came in. Like my parents had Stevie Wonder records and stuff like that, and yeah, but it doesn't feel like it naturally came from whatever they came from. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the bands that were influences on them, I wouldn't have discovered really until much later.
Nice. Well, let me ask you
Yeah.
this. What other bands during that time period would you say, and maybe we don't know them, and that might be the point of asking this question, what other bands were big in either Europe as a whole or the Netherlands and Holland specifically that never really broke in the US and are still considered, like, for instance, in Japan,
Hmm.
Deep Purple is bigger than Led Zeppelin. They're like the biggest classic rock band ever.
Yeah.
Richie Blackmore is like in place of somebody like Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton.
Yeah.
Like they were huge and still are as like the classic rock band. And that's not really
Yeah.
true at maybe, as far as I know, anywhere else in the world. Deep Purple's big in the States, but I think they were even bigger in Europe than they were in the States. Were there other bands like that in like Mother's Finest that were specific to either Europe or specifically the Netherlands?
Um, I can only think of a couple. There's a singer named Beth Hart who I think you know.
Yep, I toured with Beth for
Exactly.
like 9 months, and she's like a pop star over there. And
She's a star.
in the States, in LA, people don't really know who she is I mean, people
No.
do, but she's a legit pop star in Holland.
He's huge over there, and you know, and it was the same thing. Once I discovered that Mother's Finest wasn't a household name in the U.S. Once once I got here, you know what I mean? I was like, what? Like how? And Beth is one of them. And anyway, we had this conversation before, and so yeah, it's cool that you toured with her. I don't know. There's like a band like Toto has like an incredible following in Europe, and they tour there regularly, and they play like festivals over there.
And here, people are like, oh, they wrote Africa, and like that's all they know.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
People
exactly.
don't really know anything else.
Yeah,
That's interesting. Yeah. It's funny how that works. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna. It's so interesting to me, the different taste that certain people have in Europe, and that so many bands can still tour and make legit a living from touring in Europe to this day. And in the States, nobody's heard of them, or they have been forgotten about completely.
Yeah. I was just gonna say I think the first time I realized that nobody knew who they were here, because it's not like I came to the States and was like, have you guys heard of Mother's Finest? You know what I mean? Like it might not have come up in conversation for like a couple of years, right?
That's a great opening line. Why
right?
Not? That's a nice way to open conversation. Hey, do you know this band? Like, I mean, a lot of people at record stores do that. I mean, it might not be a bad idea.
Great icebreaker. I should try that. But I was on tour. This is in 2005-ish again. And I was on tour, and our guitar player on the tour was from North Carolina, and he and I are still great friends. And you know, and it was one of those nights sort of after a show, and there's the tour bus, and you got the little folding chairs, and everybody's kind of like chilling by the side of the bus, right? The hot night or whatever. And had a little speaker going on, and I guess I was DJing with my iPod. And at some point, Mother's Finest came on, right? And the guitar player, who again is from North Carolina, he was like, "Is that Mother's Finest?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "How the fuck do you know who Mother's Finest are?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Right? And so we had to have this whole conversation where I was like, "No, but they're like huge in Holland." And he's like, "What?" You know, because to him, that was a band that he knew from back in the day, right? Because he's roughly my age, a little bit older.
Yeah.
And so they were massive in regionally, and I think for him as an active, you know, gigging musician and touring regionally, like he certainly would have heard of them, and he loved them.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't you being like, oh, you know about Mother's Finest. It was flipped on its head, where he asked you that, and he's like, had the realization that, oh, people don't know who these guys are.
Don't know who these guys are, right? And and I mean, I have a bunch of stories like that. Butch Walker, who I play with, is from Georgia, and we've had this conversation. And in fact, I called him yesterday because I was kind of like, I just kind of want to like refresh my memory about like what his history was with them. And he said, we idolized those guys. We worshiped them. And in fact, after his band South Gang, before they formed Marvelous 3, he had a band called Floyd's Funk Revival. And it's a short-lived band, but he was like, we were just trying to be Mother's Finest, and modeled their band after them, and they got to open up for them in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
90s, yeah, at a show in Georgia. And he was like, they were so amazing. That was the time when the singer's kid had already taken over on drums, right?
Gotcha. And was Butch's favorite record by them the live record, the same record?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about that earlier, but yeah, I mean, it's in the same way that it was for me, and now in your very new experience, it's just so undeniable, and certainly like the greatest testament of what they were capable of as a band.
Yeah. I'm really curious to hear. I'm sure the Allman Brothers co-build stuff with them, being that they're a Georgia band as well.
I think, right?
I wonder. I mean, that era would have been obviously post Barry Oakley and post Duane Allman, but they were still touring.
Yeah,
I'm very curious. I might look that up and find out if they ever build together, because that would, man, talk about a show, right?
Yeah,
Mother's Finest and the Allman Brothers. Oh
yeah. My God. Here's another funny one. A good buddy of mine His name is Andy Hess. He's a bass player. He lives in New York. He's awesome.
He's a fantastic. I don't know him personally, but he's an amazing bass
yeah, he play with all kinds of greats, and then he and I've been long time friends. His mom is German, and he spent part of his childhood in Germany, and so he has a mother's finest habit in the same way that I do, but from living in Germany, right? Which is yeah, oh yeah. And so at some point we were at a friend's place that was in Los Angeles, and we just went down a mother's finest hole. You know what I mean? Yeah. We were just like, and just like putting it on the stereo and just like freaking out over it. And whoever else, poor, friends that we were with, they were
stop playing this record.
They were very kind about it for like a really long time. Eventually, they're like, you guys should shut the fuck up about this band already.
That's hilarious. Well, here's a funny thing. Now I don't know Andy personally, but right. Because I was such an Allman Brothers fanatic, I was a Government Mule fanatic. And that's when I found out about Andy Hess. I eventually know his playing from the John Scofield stuff because that stuff's some of my favorite too. But when you sent me this, for some reason I had this thing in my head where I was like, I think where I've heard Mother's Finest was from Warren Haynes. Because as I thought about it, I was like, what band plays hard rock, maybe not straight up funk, but has a big like funk influence in hard rock? And I was like, Government Mule does. Yeah. And I actually looked up Mother's Finest and Warren Haynes and Mother's Finest Government Mule. I couldn't find anything, but I was like, I have a feeling Warren Haynes probably being a Southern guy, playing with the Allman Brothers forever, having a band that's like probably more hard rock, classic rock base, but clearly has, especially the era when Andy was in the band. Yeah. Other than the Alan Woody era, the earlier era, where they were more of a Cream type trio. But when Andy was in the band and they had organ, it was very much a Mother's Finest with a little bit less funk and a little bit more rock. Right. And I was curious. I still want to find that out but that's funny that you bring up Andy because that was something I immediately shifted to.
After I hung out with him and we geeked out over Mother's Finest for an entire night, the next day I posted something on Instagram, I think, about Mother's Finest, and I think just posted a picture of us like whatever, like lying around the living room, and then mentioned the band in it, and I probably tagged him or something like that. And then the guitar player of Mother's Finest from the era that I knew them, right? He goes by Moses Mo. His name is actually Gary Moore, not that Gary Moore.
I know. I saw that and was like, oh, that's no wonder he changed his. It was a good move.
Yeah. So he reacted. He, you know what I mean? He liked my post or something like that. And it was one of those things where, we talked earlier about like how, back in the day, the band that you idolized was just some pictures, right? The like mythical creatures that lived on a different plane that you had absolutely nothing to do with. Totally. And so for him to like my post, I was kind of like, what? You know what I mean? Like,
huge deal. I mean,
and so I wrote to him, and of course, and had a nice exchange about, you know what I mean? And so, of course, the predictable stuff about how much I love this band and how much, their records had meant to me. And he was super gracious about it. And we just kind of kept in touch, just on Instagram. And every once in a while, he'll like my post and I'll like his, and they're still playing. And so that was crazy already. And then in the lead up to this, I wrote to him, just saying that I was going to do this, right? And cool. And he wrote back about the night that they recorded that concert. He was like, it was such a magical night, which sort of like solidified for me, like this was an actual one concert night, right? That they recorded and put on a record, as opposed to like was recorded over the course of, a month.
They must not have had been given like a massive budget to be like, we recorded 6 shows and then edited them all together and added.
No, right.
It was like, I'm sure Kiss had a lot more, sort of money behind them because they were like a press machine even before they had crossover hits.
For sure.
And I know Mother's Finest had a weird situation with record labels after the initial thing. I think it was with CBS or was it RCA? I can't remember, but they got like boned and they were not happy with it at all. I think it was RCA, but they were very apprehensive with that. And I'm sure they probably didn't have the biggest budget, but they didn't need it.
Yeah, right, exactly, because they could record a show and then that was
right.
And so yeah, so he was talking about what a magical night that was, and then he mentioned something about how he how he was in California every once in a while. This is Moses Mo, the guitar player, because Wizard, not Spider, Wizard lives
not Spider, Wizard. Yep.
Lives in Santa Monica with his family, and I was like, oh, holy shit! And so I wrote Wizard.
You did?
I did, like a week ago. And same thing, just a whatever, like a lengthy, fanboy, message about, about this podcast. And you know what I mean? I was just like, hey, I just wanted to say hey and tell you how much I appreciate what you guys created. And
that's awesome. He's such a sweetheart, man. Like when I watched his interview with Craig on Everyone Loves Guitar, he just seems like a rad dude. I was just like, this guy rocks. He's clearly like super positive, and just has like a good heart. Clearly, like I didn't get to finish it. I watched most of it, but I was like, man, this guy's awesome. He was playing with Jackie Wilson when he was 13.
Wow, man, I had no idea.
13. He was playing. He filled in for, I believe, his brother got drafted to Vietnam, and his brother was like, "This is your gig now, dude." And he did like I think just a summer with Jackie Wilson on bass at 13 years old.
I need to listen to that whole interview. But he wrote back, and because you're right, he's a sweetheart, and nice message, and of course he saw my name, and and he was like, he told me that Glenn Murdoch, who was the male singer in Mother's Finest, had a teenage band in Chicago, wait for it, called the Whynots.
No shit. Did they spell it as one word, like you go by like? I
mean, that's how he wrote it to me. So, I tried looking him up, and I couldn't find anything because you know what I
mean. Did he mention that like, hey, your people have been good to my band? Like,
you know what?
Dutch.
I mentioned that in my initial message to him because you know what I mean. Like it's so obvious to me as a fan, and for sure to them as a band that they were huge and still are. You know what I mean? Like they still play there regularly.
Oh, that's great, man.
So like I acknowledge it in my, as a Dutch guy, I don't have to tell you, you guys were huge over there, and all that stuff. But yeah,
he's so awesome, man.
He's right nearby.
Well, I really hope people go and check this live record out.
Yeah,
and go watch the Rock Palace thing, because it is. I mean, I can imagine if I were the headlining band, I would want to be pushed like these dudes were pushed, having them open, because if you're the Who or Sabbath or AC/DC, you better bring it. I mean, luckily those bands and Wizard mentions this in that interview, they brought it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like, I've heard stories about AC/DC when they played the Monsters of Rock festival. Mm-hmm. All the metal bands were like, "There's no fucking way we're following AC/DC."
Right.
I don't care that we're Metallica or we're Slayer. You can't follow AC/DC. They kick too much ass. Yeah. And I imagine Mother's Finest had a reputation similar to that, where it's like they brought it so hard that like you got to blow your drums up like Keith Moon in order to be memorable.
Yeah.
Playing after Mother's Finest, because I imagine live it was just so much energy that people were freaking out.
I feel like Bob Marley and the Wailers got kicked off of Sly and the Family Stone tour for kicking too much ass, for being too good, and they were like stranded in California. I don't know if I have the details right about that story, but like they were basically like, we can't deal with this.
I mean, dude, I hope somebody picks "Catch a Fire," the Jamaican version of that, because that's in my top 5 or 10 records of all time. I imagine that, but one of the things that Wizard mentioned in the interview with Craig was something that I think is very important, which he was like, when he brought up Van Morrison, I think a lot of our reactions like, oh man, he probably blew Van Morrison off the stage or Mother's Finest. And he was like, what Van Morrison brought was not volume. He brought vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And he was not going to try to compete with us on a volume and energy level. And he didn't try. Yeah. And you know what? It worked, because it's like a pin drop you could hear with Van Morrison playing. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, because it's actually something that particularly we're talking about metal, I hear this all the time, like, oh man, these bands are so heavy, these like 7-string bands. And I'm like, dude, Pantera played in like standard tuning for most of their stuff, and that shit is 10 times heavier than almost any of this like 8-string down-tuned stuff. It's like, it's not about, you can sort of, there's like a misnomer, a misunderstanding of like what actually affects, it's the emotional impact. It's not just the quote unquote tuning of the guitars or the heaviness of the distortion. Like you can go to a show in the 70s and see Mother's Finest kick ass on an energy volume level, and then have Van Morrison come out and basically have like a seance. You know what I mean? Where it's people feel like they're in some sort of like womb-like environment, and they flow together perfectly. And I think that that's an important thing that I'm glad that Wizard mentioned that, because it was something I was like, man, that's such a great point. Because some people are just like, dude, I bet you crush Van Morrison. Like that guy's a singer-songwriter guy. Ugh. And it's like, no, like Van Morrison's got some serious vibe. And I bet that was an amazing show. Dynamically was like killer. Killer.
Yeah, man.
Well, man, I'm glad that you introduced me to Mother's Finest. If any of the members of Mother's Finest ever watch this, I'm very happy to be introduced to your music. I'm glad that I've already, it's like the 5th week of this podcast, I've already found a ton of new records and stuff that are now mean a lot to me as well. Because I mean, I've spent a lot of time listening to both these albums this week. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we get into maybe where people can find you in your social media about either Mother's Finest Live or about Tears for Fears that you didn't get out into the sphere this time?
Not really, man. No, I think we covered it all. You know, it was hard. It was hard to pick these records in a certain way, because obviously there's not only 2 records, right, that have had an impact on me. But I sort of figured that these 2 were a nice juxtaposition to each other, right? Like sort of like opposites in a lot of ways. And I think if you distilled what either of them meant to me musically, you sort of like know a lot about who I am as a musician, if that makes any sense.
Completely. I think the live factor that you mentioned, and the mixing of styles is important with this record. And then with the other record, like seeing things compositionally first, I think you're right. I think that really sums up a lot about you, but I get that it's hard to choose. I was talking to somebody the other day. I'm such a hypocritical just asshole, because somebody was like, hey, tell me about the podcast. And I told them about it. And they're like, that's really cool. If you were to be a guest on your own podcast, which records would you choose? I'm like, you can't ask me that. I had literally no idea.
Right.
Like there's so many records. I mean, 2 of the records that I mentioned earlier, because live records mean a lot, would be Band of Gypsies or Allman Brothers Live at the Fillmore. But I was immediately like offended. I was like, how dare you ask me 2 records? Like I've got such a wide swath of musical taste. And I realized like, man, I'm putting these people under a lot of pressure to choose 2 records. And for people that eat, sleep, and breathe music, it's got to just be an absolute painful experience. So I appreciate you getting through it and choosing records that were great conversation, both of them. If people were to find you, outside of going to your All Music and seeing, what records you played on and checking that out, where can people find you on maybe Instagram, and does that link up to your other social media and all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, my All Music page is vastly incomplete, and if you're listening, All Music, help me.
I completely understand that. It's too bad that that's sort of the primary source, because it's not good enough. But
anyway, it's fine. I have a website called whytunes.com, WHYTUNES, and it's sort of like all 3 of the sort of like the 3 tiers of my current musical life: bass playing, composing, and mastering, which I've done a bunch of in the last couple of years, and that seems to be growing. So anyway, it sort of covers all of those, and Whynot Jansveld is my Instagram handle.
Yeah, and that'll all be in the show notes. There's also one thing that we can't mention. We talked about it before the podcast. There's a very cool project that Whynot was involved in playing on and also mastering that we can't talk about yet. But if it comes out before this episode airs, because this episode's not going to actually air for several weeks, I will include that in the show notes, because it's a really cool project, and I wish we could talk about it, but we just due to legal obligations we can't do that yet. But I hope
or moral, yeah, and
moral, yeah.
it may be a while still because it's it's crazy times, and obviously people think twice or 10 times before they decide it's time to put out a record that you can't even tour on currently. So
I get it, man.
Might be a minute.
That happened with all the Bill and Ted stuff. Like there were several different dates, and there was like it was going to be released in theaters, but then theaters closed, and then it was everything's in flux. But let's say it does take a while. We'll have you back on the podcast, give you another 2 choices so you can really expand, and then we can introduce that project maybe when it comes out.
Sure.
Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Cool.
We just
Why not?
For 2 hours, man. Holy cow.
Crazy, right? This was fun as hell. I love doing this every week. I've been finding out information about people that I already know well. I find out new stuff about them. So this is just a blast. Whynot Jansveld, thank you for doing this, buddy. Stay on the line and we'll wrap up. But thank you. This has been Album Impact with Joshua Ray Gooch, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me, Josh.